All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors. I thank Leah Sol, our TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Adar Beis, for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month. In honor of all of those who, Baruch Hashem, made a beautiful and uplifting groundbreaking, we thank Leah for her dedication and for her generosity. Rabbos, with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chaf Aleph, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on, let me just shut this off, and we are picking up on Chaf Beis, 20b. So let's remember again, we left off a little bit mid-sugya. We're dealing with the Mishnah, just to reorient ourselves a little bit. I'm going to try to get back on track with the short Chazara summaries, Meretz Hashem, for each daf as well. Go back starting from the Mishnah. So let's remember again in the Mishnah, what we were introduced to is the concept ultimately of what we called Isser Mitzvah, Isser Kedusha. We translated the concept according to the first approach in the Gemara, Isser Mitzvah being a situation where the marriage, the Yibum marriage, would be an Isser D'Rabbanan versus an Isser Kedusha, which we focused on women who would be prohibited to a Kohen, or for that matter, again, a Mamzeres or a Nesina. This led to the question, or the Gemara's assumption, that halacha l'maisa, when it comes to the Kohen's prohibition to do Yibum with a Yevamos who is an Almana, so we made no distinction whether she's an Almana from Irisin or an Almana from Nisuin. And by the way, the Kohen in question is not just any regular Kohen, right? Either go big or you go home, right? So again, this is the Kohen Gadol. So remember, we made no distinction whether or not she's widowed from Irisin or from Nisuin, to which the Gemara said, well, that's really strange. Because at the end of the day, I understand that she's widowed from Nisuin, because then why? You have an assay of Yibum, but what? You have a los assay of Amana, and an assay of Bisula. But if she's widowed from Irisin, then all I have is the los assay of Almana, because we assume that she's still a Besula. Let the assay of Yibum be doche, the los assay of Almana. So we spent all of yesterday's daf really trying to figure out why doesn't that work? Why doesn't that logic work? So with that, let's pick up. So Chaf Beis 20b, end of the first wide line on the bottom. Elo Amarava, Gezerah Bia Rishona Atu Bia Shnia. To which Rava said, you're right. The truth is, Rabbi said, and this is so fascinating. The svara works. In other words, if you have a situation of a Yevama who falls to her brother-in-law, who is the Kohen Gadol, right, and she is an Almana from Irisin, right? So the truth is, the logic is sound. The Kohen Gadol brother-in-law should be able to do Yibum because the assay of Yibum will be doched the lo saseh of Almana. The only problem is, that only works for what? To accomplish the Bia Rishona. What doesn't allow for? The sustaining of this marriage. Because the Meister will say, for the Bia Rishona, that allows her to have relations with her. But after that, the prohibition of Almana kicks back in. This is fascinating. Once the prohibition of Almana kicks back in, ultimately that becomes prohibited. And remember, the assay of Yibum only applies to which Bia? To the Bia Rishona. But take a look at Rashi. Let's see it inside. Rashi says, Bia Rishona, the Gzer Bia Rishona, the Mekayim Ba'asei U'matzi L'mitri, Atu Bia Shnia, the lo Matzi L'mitri, the Ha'ikayim Ba'asei. So we'll say, this is really incredible. It also gives you a little bit of an insight into the mechanics of Yibum. So Yibum said, let's just play this out for just a moment, right? Reuven and Shimon. Shimon passes away, leaves a widow, simple case, one wife, no one's related to each other, no arayas, nothing going on over here, right? So Shimon passes away, leaves behind the wife Rachel. Reuven, the surviving brother, is a Kohen Gadol. Ultimately, again, let's say for just a moment, for our purposes right now, when Shimon passed away, he had not done Nisuin. He only did Erisin. So now Rabbi say, here are the mechanics. So remember, the Kohen Gadol Reuven has to do Yibum, but also as Kohen Gadol can't marry a widow. So for the Bia Rishona, which is the Yibum Bia, he could engage in that. What's the halachic argument? Aseh of Yibum is docha the lo saseh of Almana. The problem is, after the Bia Rishona, so now Yibum has been accomplished. If he were to have relations with her a second time, would that be permitted? No. Why? Because again, there's no longer an assay, and what do you have? What are you left with, so to speak? Almana. And therefore, again, the Gemara says, you're right, the logic works to allow for Bia Rishona, but the logic would not work to allow for Bia Shnia. So the Gemara says, therefore, Allah Amar Rava, Gzeira Bia Rishona, Atu Bia Shnia, which literally means we prohibit the first Bia, lest they come to engage in the second Bia. Which I will say is also a fascinating discussion we can get into, which is, does halacha encourage a yibum that cannot lead to a sustainable marriage? Because that's the situation over here. It's fascinating. Ruvain, the surviving brother, who's also the Kohen Gadol, could fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. But it's fascinating. But what can't he do? What can't he do? Remain married to this woman. So so again, we're going to leave that on the side because we're going to see a couple of cases like this. Not today, but in subsequent dapim. But the Gemara says, you're right. You're right, but you're wrong. You're right in that the yibum could occur, but ultimately what we're concerned is if we allow Bia Rishona, they'll come to engage in Bia Shnia, and Bia Shnia really is an Isser D'Oraisa. Granted, not kares, it's an Isser Lav, but an Isser nevertheless. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, Taina Yachabais that supports this, in Ba'alu Kanu. So also going back to our previous cases, this is why halacha l'maisa, even in the previous case, remember yesterday's daf of the p'tzudaka, the krushavcha, as much as there is a lav for these men to marry these women, if they had relations, they affect yibum. So the Gemara says, "Balu kana b'bia rishona, va'asar lekaiman b'bia shnia." But ultimately, again, the bia you can make a cogent argument to allow for the bia rishona, asay dochelosa, asay a whole bunch of other things. But lamaisa, that only works in the Bia Rishona, which is an asay. But after that, the Isser kicks in. Taminami Haks, good. So the Gemara says, Hadam Rava. So subsequently, Rava said, Vitim Ravashi, Lav Milsihi da Amri. Subsequently, Rava retracted this position. Now Rashi says over here, in this version of Rava is saying that halacha l'maisa, the first Bia is absolutely permitted. The logic works. The assay of Bia will be, the assay of Yibum will be Docha, the Lo Saseh, whether it's of Amar the Kohen Gadol or maybe even Ptsuadaka. So then, subsequently, Rava rejected this. Vitim Rav Milsa. Da Amar, Reish Lakish, Komakum Sha'ata Motse Assay, Velo Saseh. They both say this is incredible. Why did Rava subsequently recant or retract this? Because of Reish Lakish. They both say this is incredible. Reish Lakish says, whenever you see a clash between an asay and a lo saseh, what's an example of a clash between an asay and a lo saseh? As all of our cases. I have a Kohen Gadol who needs to do yibum. There's an asay of yibum. There's a lo saseh that he's not allowed to marry a widow. So Rose said, this is incredible. So Reish Lakish says, whenever you find a clash between an asay and a lo saseh, ematu yochol l'kayim shnehem mutov. Ve'im lav yavo asay v'yitches lo saseh. Incredible. See, I will say, Reish Lakish says, hey, everybody calm down. When we say asay doche lo saseh, I will say, when is that? When you don't have other options to be mekayim both of them. So in other words, if you have an asay and you have a lo saseh, and they clash, and there's no way to reconcile the two, then the conclusion is the asay will override the lo saseh. But if you have a conflicting asay and lo saseh, and somehow you could fulfill them both, that's better. So watch what Reish Lakish says. Therefore, in this case, what's the halacha? Hachanami efsha bechalitza timekayim asay velos asay. Therefore, Reish Lakish will say, come on, there is a way to be mekayim both of these things, right? You have a Kohen Gadol who needs to do yibum. So everybody's jumping on asay dochelos asay. Let the man do yibum. Why, says Reish Lakish? There's way to be mekayim the asay and the lo saseh. How? Chalitza. Chalitza counts. At least Reish Lakish is positing that chalitza counts as a fulfillment of the asay of yibum, but at the same time he does not go ahead and in any way shter his kedushas kahuna. To which the Gemara says, Meisvei ve'en ba'alu kanu. The problem with that Abosai is, the Brisa said before, by the P'tuadak and the Krush Shavcha, that Allah Chalamaysa, if they did have relations with the Yevama, it works. So it sounds like even in a case where you can fulfill the Asay and the Lo Sa'asay, that through Chalitza, that you should do that. But over here it sounds like that even if you do not do that, but again, you allow the Asay to trump the Lo Sa'asay, that works. Tiyufta. Indeed, this refutes this last position of Reish Lakish. So we'll say, there's a couple of interesting, we'll get to Halacha Ma'aseh in just a moment, but there's a couple of interesting things over here. How the Gemara seems to view, or Reish Lakish seems to view, Chalitza as a fulfillment of Yibum. Right? Isn't that fascinating? You see, we've been programmed a little bit to think that Chalitza is the non-fulfillment, it's like the halachic out from Yibum. It's a halachic out, but it's not Yibum. Reish Lakish seems to float to Halloween, which is absolutely riveting, which is that no, Chalitza is another form of fulfilling Yibum. Now even Reish Lakish might agree, perhaps it's not an ideal form of Yibum fulfillment, but a form of Yibum fulfillment nevertheless. Therefore I will say, what are we left with? Okay, so now, again, I just want to point out, we need answers, right? And I feel we're entitled to answers, right? We've been one blot into this sugi already. So here's what we have. We know, let's start with what we know. What do I know? In Yevamos, very little. But here's what I think I know. When I have a Yibum relationship that's an Isser Kares, what happens in that situation, right? Reuven dies, leaves behind two wives, Rachel, Leah. Rachel is Shimon, the surviving brother's daughter. What happens in that case? Nothing, right? Nothing. When I have a Kares case, so Kares, remember again, essentially says Yibum does not apply here. Not only that, but again, remember the Erva wife will exempt the co-wife, the Tzara. The cases we're dealing with now are more nuanced, which are because Isser Mitzvah, Isser Kiddusha. Women who are an Erva Midrabanan, or women who are Asura Midoraisa, but what type of Isser? Lav. What do we do with these women? Included in that list is, let's say, the widow is a Mamzeres. So we'll say, listen to this. Rambam, Hilchos Yibum V'Chalitza, Perek Vav, Halacha Yud. Listen carefully, here it is. Haisa hayavama asura alayiv. Haisa yavama asura alayivama. Isser lav o isser asay o shaisa shnia. So we'll say in any case where the yavama is asura to the yavam, right? So again, Reuven dies. No co-wives right now. Reuven dies, leaves behind the widow Rachel. Right now, Rachel is either asura to Shimon because of an asay, a lav, shnia, which rabbinic are asking to get to. That's our next sugya. So what's the halacha? Harei ze choletzes v'lo misyavemes. She requires chalitza. So obviously we'll say Yibum is going to be aser. Now, why is Yibum aser? Let nasei bidocha lo sasei. We're going to get to that. But halacha l'maisa, she has to do chalitza. She can't do Yibum. Umipnei ma tzricha chalitza. I will say, by the way, you should know, there is, the Shulchan Aruch has Hilchos Chalitza, right, in Even HaEzer. So the reason I'm often quoting to you from the Rambam is just because the Rambam provides such a beautiful explanation to these sugyas as well. So that's why, again, and also the Shulchan Aruch is passing in pretty much the same way. But again, Meima tzricha chalitza. I love the Rambam. So why do you need chalitza? Mipnei sheyesh balikuchin hoil v'kiddushin tovsin bahen harehin zekukos liavam. So I remember again, you'll say, well, why do you need chalitza over here? These women are asuros, right? They're asur to the yavam. It's true. They're asuros. So I'll say, what's the nature of the isser? A lav and an asay. What's the halacha if you're mekadesh a woman who is asura to you because of a lav or an asay? Tovsin. We don't pass like Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva is the only opinion who says that kiddushin ain't tovsin b'chai b'lavin. We don't pass in that way. So all of these women, as much as they are asur to me, to the yavam, lemaisa, you can marry them. And if you were to marry them, it would be prohibited. But so because of that, there is a zeka band, and because there is a zeka band, therefore chalitza is required. Uminadin, listen to this, here we go. Uminadin, hayu sheyis yab mushayim mitzvah sasei, v'chol makum sha'ata motze asei v'lo sasei, yavo asei v'yitchelo sasei. And even though it says that Rambam really should do yibum in these cases. Why? Because yibum is an asei. These women are prohibited through a lo sasei. Let the asei of yibum come and be docha the lo sasei. Here we go. Allah chachamim gazru shelo yisyabmu chay ve'lavin v'lo shnios gezerah shema yavo aleha pam shnia v'harei bi'asa asura ve'ein sham mitzvah shein mitzvahs asay ela bia rishon abel. Rabbi say exactly that we just saw in the Gemara. Chazal said, what are we concerned about? You're right. Asay dochelos asay las rabia rishona. But by the Bia Shnia, there is no asay. Therefore, Chazal were concerned that if we allow you to marry this woman, although the Bia Rishona would be permitted, the Bia Shnia would not. And obviously, there would be a concern that they would come to engage in a second act of relations. Lefichach. So therefore, Abba say, Halacha L'maisa, the Rambam Paskins, any situation where the Yevama, the widow, is prohibited to the Yavam, either because of an asay, a lo sa'aseh, or a binek harayos, the halacha is you must do chalitza, you cannot do yibum. And therefore I will say, watch this. What if the Yavam went against the halacha and did yibum? Lefichachim avar ubal yivim to ha'asura lo mishum lav or mishum aseh ve'in tzarech lo mishniya harei zekana kinyan gamer. It works. So I will say, if the Kohen Gadol does do yibum with his widowed sister-in-law, right? Lamaisa, as much as he's not supposed to do it, if he did it, it works. Umotzia beget. But ultimately, again, he's not allowed to live with her. So after he does yibum, affects yibum, therefore essentially affects marriage with her, halach l'mais, he has to divorce her afterwards. So this is how the Rambam Paskins, halach l'mais again, in a case where the Yevama is asura alts kares, no yibum at all. Where she's asura alts alav and asay, ultimately choletzes, the law is Yevamos. You must do chalitza, can't do yibum for the mechanics that the Rambam spelled out. Absolutely beautiful. Good. Itmar, bias Kohen Gadol ba'almana. So we'll say, what happens if a Kohen Gadol has relations with an almana? Again, this is talking about a situation where, same idea, Reuven passes away, leaves behind the wife Rachel, so his surviving brother Shimon is the Kohen Gadol. Shimon's not supposed to do yibum with Rachel, but let's say he does. What's the halacha? Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Chadamar Eina Poter Sarasa. One opinion says the act of yibum does go ahead and exempt the co-wife. Let's say it's Rachel and Leah. So now Shimon, the surviving brother, who's the Kohen Gadol, does yibum with Rachel. So one opinion says, okay, Aser, but it works, and therefore it exempts the co-wife. The Chad Amar Poteres Ina Poteres Sarasa. I'm sorry. Chad Amar Ina Poteres Sarasa. The Chad Amar Poteres Sarasa. So one opinion said that halacha l'maisa, the act of yibum with Rachel exempts Leah from everything. She's done. She's out. Right? She's out. Other opinion says no, it does not. Top of Chaf Aleph. Ba'amana minan isuin koli amalo pligi telo petira. De'ein asay dochelo sasay va'asay. So listen to this. When we're talking about a widow who is widowed from Nisuin, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, well, everyone agrees. So everyone agrees that the act of yibum will not exempt the co-wife. Why not? Because they both say it's an invalid act of yibum. Why? Because what do you have when she's an almana from Nisuin? An asay of yibum against what, on the other hand? A lo sa'asay of almana and an asay of besula. So everyone will agree that an asay can't be docha another lo sa'asay va'asay. So in that case again, when the Kohen Gadol does yibum with an almana from Nisuin, everyone will agree that the co-wife is not in the clear. Keep ligi ba'almana b'nei erusin. But where does the machlokes come up? In a case where a woman, the surviving widow, was widowed from erusin. Man Amar Poteres, the opinion that says that when Shimon, the surviving brother, does yibum with the almana, that it goes ahead and exempts the co-wife. Asiyase, the dachi is lo sase. Both says you've been mistaken until now, because the asay of yibum will essentially be dochi the lo sase of almana. Uman do Amar Eino Poteres, and the opinion who says that it doesn't pater. Lo asi asay v'dachi is lo sa'asay. Kevan def shebechalitza. The other people say, no, it doesn't exempt the co-wife. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, there's an option of chalitza. And I will say, I ruin this for you a little bit, because we already did this in the Rambam. Let's just go through the sugya. Meisvei, the Gemara says, v'im ba'alu kanu, by the krush shivchanu p'tzua. As much as they're not allowed to do yibum, if they did it, it works, tiyufta. Ultimately, again, that is indeed a refutation. Lema tehevinami tiyufta de Reish Lakish. I shouldn't dispute a refutation of Reish Lakish. So we'll say, remember again, what does Reish Lakish say? Reish Lakish says something very profound. When do we say asay docha lo sasay? When there's no way to uphold both the asay and the lo sasay. But Reish Lakish says when you could uphold the asay and the lo sasay, we don't say let the asay come and be docha lo sasay. So we'll say in these cases, can you uphold the asay and the lo sasay? What's the answer? Yes. How? Chalitza. So the fact that Allah l'maisa, the Brisa doesn't accept them, seems to be a refutation of Reish Lakish. Amr l'Sidi Gemara. So Amr l'Charish Lakish Kamina Ana Hecha D'Mekaymi Mitzvah. Aval Hacha Chalitza B'Makom Yibam Lav Mitzvahi. Oh, see, Rabbi say, remember what bothered us with Rish Lakish? Remember what bothered us? What bothered us was Rish Lakish made it sound like Chalitza is a form of fulfillment of Yibam. Rish Lakish says, no, I never said that. I never said that. What I said was, the only time we'll say aseh doch lo saseh is when you can't fulfill both. But lamaisa, when you can fulfill both, ultimately that's ideal. The Gemara then interpreted that to mean that according to Rish Lakish, you should do chalitza, because chalitza allows you to fulfill the aseh of yibum, and also go ahead and uphold the lo saseh of marrying these prohibited people. To which Rish Lakish himself now says, by the way, I never said that chalitza is a form of yibum, which I will say is very helpful to us. So now we kind of take that concept off the table. Now I will say, in terms of this last piece, I jumped the gun a little bit with the Rambam. The Rambam already said that halacha l'maisa, if the Kohen Gadol were to go ahead and do yibum, whether it's yibum, ultimately again with halacha l'maisa, with an almana from nisuin, or amana from erusin, bottom line is it's asr, he should not do it. But if he did it, it works, right? It's yibum. He's then obligated to do what? Divorce her, give her a get right afterwards. And obviously because the yibum with the almana works, any tsaros, right? Any co-wives who are there would be exempted through that yibum as well. Incredible. But we now transition to our next sugya. Amar Rava. Remez l'shnios min haTorah minayin. Rabbi say, now we come. I sent out this chart on the WhatsApp group. It's the chart. I just took it from the art scroll. This is the chart. It's not a family tree. I mean, if this is someone's family tree, it's a highly dysfunctional family, right? But lamaisa again, this is the case of shnios l'tumah, shnios la'arayos, which Rabbi say is the case of rabbinic arayos. Essentially, we're going to see that halacha l'maisa, there are biblical arayos, and then as you're going to see over here, and this chart is very helpful. So you're going to see that there are biblical ervas, biblical arayos, and then again a whole bunch of rabbinic cases that are added on, again, in order to safeguard the biblical arayos. So the Gemara said, before we delve into this list, Amar Rava, remez l'shnios min haTorah minayin. In general, how do we know that halacha l'maisa, there's a concept of what we call shnios. We will say shnios means secondary arayos, rabbinic arayos. From where do we know this? From Shneimar, ki es kol ha'toivos ha'el asu anshe ha'aretz. Pasuk says, because all of these abominations, ultimately, again, the people of the land committed vatitma haaretz. Now, both say this is a reference over here to the terrible behaviors of the nations indigenous to Eretz Yisrael. So ultimately, again, the Gemara Torah uses the lashon of ha'el. Now, remember, it should have said ha'ela or ha'elu ha'el. So the Gemara says, what is ha'el? Kashos. I will say the lashon of ha'el indicates a certain severity of lashon. Look at Rashi. Kaksiv ha'el mikala tvaivos ha'ela v'nichrasa. So the Gemara says ha'el kashos michlal di'ika rakos. So we'll say ha'el. We're going to see in just a moment is a strong lashon, which sounds like there are arayas that are kasha, that are strong, that are difficult, and then there's what we'll call softer or weaker arayos. Umayninu, we'll say what exactly is the category of softer or weaker arayos? Shnios, rabbinic categories. Umayn mashma ha'el lishna de kashahu. How do you know that ha'el is a lashon of kasha, of difficult, of strong? Dichsiv ve'es elia ares lakach. Gemara over here quotes the pasuk from Yecheskel. Ve'es elia ares lakach. Rabbi, I reference the fact that Nebuchadnezzar exiled leadership before he exiled the common man. So you see a lashon of Ele. So Lema Pligid Rabbi Levi. So this seems to argue on Rabbi Levi. What is Rabbi Levi? See, Rabbi Levi, both say first wide line on Chafal from Nalif. Kash is incredible. Kasha onshin shal midos, yoser me onshin shal arayos. Rabbi say this is actually a pretty wild Gemara. The punishment for using false weights and measures, or false is maybe the wrong word. The punishment for using skewed weights and measures is more severe than the punishment for arayos. Shezet ne'emar bahen el, v'zet ne'emar bahen eila. Because the Rebbe says we're going to see when it comes to measurements, ultimately the Torah uses the word el, and by arayos it uses the word eila. So el is considered to be a stronger lashon. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Zeh ne'emar bahen el, v'zeh ne'emar bahen eila. So el kasha, so the Gemara says el kasha, ve'eila kasha me'el. So the Gemara says as follows. I'm sorry, I just lost the place. I'm sorry. Let's read that again. Don't remember, lady. Kasha onshin shal midos yoshim onshin shal rayos. Shezeh ne'emar bahen el, v'zeh ne'emar bahen eila. To which the Gemara says el kasha, ve'eila kasha me'el. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the way to understand it is el is kasha, but eila is even more severe. So the Gemara says gabay rayos nami haksiv. But by rayos it also says eila. Midos mikaris. Both said that comes to go ahead and exclude the use of false weights and measures from kares. So if that's the case, both say, how do you say, it's so interesting, how do you say that weights and measures, the use of false weights and measures, or, right, well, I'll use the word false, but, right, false weights and measures, or skewed weights and measures, is even worse than arayos, even worse than immorality. They both say this is incredible. Hani efshar b'tshuva, hani lo efshar b'tshuva. So I both say here's the assumption. Look at Rashi for just a moment. It's the first short line in Rashi. Arayos efshar b'takana. Rashi has takana. Kolzman shelo holid mamzer yifro shemenu v'yischarit. See, I both say if a person engaged in an act of immorality, as long as that act did not produce a mamzer, you could do tshuva for that act. Right, the person, Rashi says, a person could separate from the woman with whom he sinned. He could do charata. He could have remorse. He can go through the various steps of tshuva. But look at Rashi, avamidos. But I will say, if a person is dishonest with weights and measures, then here's the problem: gazel asarabim. The assumption is he is stolen from the general public. Ve'inu yodeya lemi yachzir. He does not know to whom to make restitution. We'll say, isn't this incredible? I don't think anyone would have ever thought this, that the Gemara would say that going ahead and using dishonest weights and measures is worse than arayos. It's worse than arayos. Simple cheshbon. Arayos, assuming you don't have a mamzer, you can go in and you can do tshuva from. But cheating the rabbim, cheating the general public, once it's done, pretty much there's no way to walk that back. Absolutely incredible. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda says that we're just right now trying to kind of find a pasuk that supports this idea of shnios, of this secondary level of arayos. So Rabbi Huda Mehacha, so the pasuk is Izen v'chiker v'tike mashalem harbe. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishlei. From Mishlei. So the Gemara says, "V'izin nichiker tikim mashalan harbe." So what does this mean? Well, Amr Ula, Amr Balazar, Kodem Sheba Shlomo, Haisa Torah Dome, Likfifa She'ein La Aznaim. Until Shlomo HaMelech came and instituted many halachas, Torah was like a basket which had no handles. Ad Sheba Shlomo, Va'asa Ba'aznaim. Until Shlomo came along and made for it handles. That's the lashon of V'izain in the pasuk. Look at Rashi. Aznaim shel kupa le'echos bahen hakupa u'mishtameres shelo tipol. So you say, what's the goal? What's the job of the handles on the basket? The handles ensure. So you say, if you try to hold the basket without handles, you run a greater risk of dropping it. The handles ensure that halacha l'maisa, you could keep a firm grasp on it. So the Gemara says like this, so too the shnios, the secondary arayos, ensure that the biblical arayos are not violated. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishlei, Pira'ehu al ta'avrabo setei me'alav va'avar. What does this mean? So the Gemara says, V'amarav Ashi, Mashal Rabbi Oshilma Davar Domer. I will say, this is really picking up on the word Pira'ehu. Rashi says over here, Hagilu. Actually, the Tosas Sharm, changes it to Hagdileu. Pira'ehu means amplify or grow it out. So Hagdilehu le'isr v'hosif alav k'dei shlo tavor bo kimo gadol para. The idea that the pasuk is saying is sometimes Rabbi saying you have to increase the scope of an isser. You have to increase the scope of the prohibition in order to safeguard the core prohibition. It gives him mashal. Mashal ma'adavadoma. La'adam mishameh pardes. If a person is trying to watch over an orchard, mishamro mibachutz kulo mishdamer. It's actually a fascinating mashal. If halacha l'mais, imagine you have an orchard, and imagine there's one entrance into the orchard. If you watch the orchard from the outside, you stand outside of the entrance, you could prevent anyone from coming into the orchard. Mishtamer kulo, right? Mishtamer mibachutz kulo mishtamer. If you guard the orchard from the outside, the entire orchard is guarded. Mishamro mibifnim, here's what's interesting. But if you guard it from the inside of the orchard, literally translated, shalafanav mishtamer, perhaps that which is in front of you can be guarded, shalacharav einu mishtamer, but that which is behind you ultimately cannot be guarded. And I'm both saying, his mashal is like this, which is really quite fascinating. If you imagine an orchard, if you're standing on the outside, you could see the orchard in its entirety, you could guard all of it. If you're standing on the inside, you could only go ahead and see what's in front of you, guard part of it. So the idea I will say is that sometimes when Chazal wanted to make certain gidarim, wanted to make protective fences, they had to make larger, all-encompassing protective fences in order to totally safeguard the biblical orchard. Because if you just make what we'll call a safeguard from the inside, you may protect certain things, but you leave other things vulnerable. It's pretty incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. But the truth is, Rav Ashi's statement is a bit mistaken, or his mashal is a bit mistaken. Why? Because I will say, at least in the case of the orchard, you're able to protect something, right? By erva, if you don't make a comprehensive gather, ultimately people will come, unfortunately, to violate biblical arayas. Okay? So the Gemara says as follows, Rav Kahana or Mehacha, Rav Kahana says from here, Ushmartem is mishmarti. The pasuk says literally again, Ushmartem is mishmarti, which literally means you will observe my observances. Asu mishmeres lemishmarti, which the Gemara Darshans means make a protective fence for those things that you are obligated to keep. So ultimately, this is a pasuk. Now this pasuk, what does this pasuk seem to sound like? The pasuk seems to say that Allah Chazal have a biblical obligation to create protective fences, which I will say would then yield a fascinating idea, which is that every dirabanan would effectively be a daraisa. To which the Gemara says, how daraisi? No. Daraisa pirsh rabbanan. It means there is a biblical mandate for Chazal to create protective fences, but Chazal defined what those protective fences are. So the Gemara says, Kol Torah nami pirsh rabbanan. But that's true in the entire Torah, right? Chazal, both say Torah Sheba'al Peh is all the way that Chazal interpret Torah Shebechsav, element rabbanon across Machta Ba'alma. Rather, both say the bottom line is, look, here's the takeaway message. There's this whole construct of shnius, this whole construct of secondary rabbinic arayos. And just understand, I was saying, all of these secondary arayos are drabbanons. The quest to find the pasuk over here is what we call an asmachta. So I'll say, what's an asmachta? We know, we're well versed in this. Asmachta just simply means the din is a drabanan. But Chazal, the rabbis, like to hang their hat on a pasuk. It's not saying that the concept is from the pasuk, right? It's not saying. I will tell you. First, Shachter Shlita has a fascinating essay in his Sefer Be'ikvei Hatzon, where he discusses this concept. Actually, I think I spoke about it one Shavuos night when we did Dinei D'Rabbanan. That there is truth to this concept that every D'Rabbanan does have an element of a D'Oraisa. And the reason for that is because the ability for Chazal to legislate law comes from where? Comes from the Torah. Right? Comes from the Torah. Their ability to legislate law comes from the Torah. Because of that, one could make the argument that every D'Rabbanan has a certain element of a D'Oraisa. Chazal speak of this and they say that called the Tikkun Rabbanan Ke'in D'Oraisa Tikkun. When Chazal instituted something, they created their law modeled after biblical law. Alright, in any event, the point over here is for shnios, All we're saying is that Allah Lamaisa, it's totally derabanan. These are rabbinic ervos, but ultimately, again, we're just basing it off a pasuk. Beautiful. Says the Gemara Tanabanan, Mahim Shniyos. So we'll say here, let's go. So let's go through the list. This is where the party starts, right? So let's go and just go. We'll say, I just want to point out, we're not actually getting into these cases right now. We're just going to list them and go through them. So here we go. Mahim Shniyos, Aim Imo, your mother's mother, Ve'im Aviv, your father's mother, grandmothers, Ve'eshes Aviv, the wife of your father's father, right? The wife of your father's father. Ve'eshes Avi Imo, the wife of your mother's father. Ve'eshes Achi Av, the wife of your father's brother. Minaim, the wife of your father's maternal brother. Ve'eshes Achi Aim Minaav, or ultimately again the wife of your mother's paternal brother. V'kalos Bino, this is your son's daughter-in-law. V'kalas bito, your daughter's daughter-in-law. Umutter adam be'eshes chamav u'be'eshes chogro. This is interesting. A man is permitted to marry his father-in-law's wife. Now, we'll say, obviously, this is not talking about your actual mother-in-law, right? Because your actual mother-in-law is the mother of your wife, right? So this is talking about your father-in-law's wife. U'be'eshes chogro. So we'll say, eshes chogro is your wife's son's wife. Again, we'll get into all of this. But you are prohibited to in your wife's daughter. V'chogro, in other words, obviously, who's not your biological daughter. V'chogro muter. V'chogro muter bi'ishto, and one's wife's daughter is permitted ultimately again to marry one's wife, who's not that person's mother, right? And ultimately meaning a second marriage. Ubito, and his daughter. Ve'eshes chogro. Omeres lo. And I will say, literally again, the wife of, this is his wife's son's wife, says to him, Omeres lo, so to speak, says to him, Ani mutaris lacha, I am permitted to you, ubiti asur lacha. But interesting, if we'll get into this, her daughter is prohibited. But so the Gemara says, 1 second, bas chogro doraisihi. We'll say, the daughter of, a person's wife's daughter, ultimately is an Isidor Isa. Dichsiv, as bas bina, ves bas bita. Right? Literally again, this is not the wife's daughter. The wife's son's daughter. Ultimately, again, is Asr, because the pasuk explicitly says, Bas bina, Bas bita, Mishum de kabay lemisni seifa, since we wanted to list the case at the end of the seifa, Eishes chogro, Omeres lo ani muteres lacha. Literally, again, the wife, Eishes chogro, says to the individual, Ani muteres lacha, technically, I am permitted to you, Ubiti asur lacha, but my daughter is prohibited to you. Va'af agav de biti asur lacha midaraisa, even though my daughter is asura to you midaraisa, bididi lo gazru beirabanan. Ultimately, interestingly enough, she is not subject to the prohibition of being a shniya latuma, a shniya le'erva. Tana reish tanami. Therefore, again, we also go to the reisha bas chogro ihachi eshes chamav nami tema. So we'll say if that's the case, then let the situation, let the wife of the father-in-law, right, one's father-in-law's wife, also say ani mutaris lacha. Technically, I am permitted to you, ubiti asur lacha, but ultimately, again, my daughter will be prohibited to you. Tahavya achos ishto, because we also remember again, the daughter of the father-in-law would ultimately again be the sister of my wife. So why doesn't she make that statement as well? Ha psikole, halo psikole, because that's a case that everybody agrees with. That's not a case that everybody agrees with. Good. So we'll say, so again, all that's happening over here, we'll say, this is a chart. This is a chart. You can see all of these cases plotted out over here. And again, you can see that the graph is color-coded, black, biblical erva, gray, what we call a shniya. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Amarav, Arba Noshim Yeshlan Hefsik. So we'll say another interesting case. There are 4 women who have a hefsik. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at the second wide line in Rashi. So we'll say there are 4 women who they are prohibited, but the generation above them and the generation below them are going to be permitted. So who are these 4 women? So the Gemara says, Nakit Rav biadei tlos. Rav said it's not 4, it's 3. Eishes achi ha'im min ha'av. Literally again, I will say, a mother's paternal brother's wife. Mother paternal's brother's wife, or I should say, the wife of the mother's paternal brother, ve'eshes achi ha'av min ha'im, and ultimately again the wife of a father's maternal brother, v'kaloso. Now, both like kaloso sounds like daughter-in-law, but we'll define that in just a moment. Uzi'iri mosif af eshes avi imo, and Zi'iri adds onto this list that even the wife of your father's mother. So I'm sorry, of your mother's father. And ultimately, again, the way to remember this, Dilayach derav. V'Rav, my time alo chashiv lei. Why doesn't Rav include this case? Michlefalei be'eshes avi aviv. Because this case can get to be confused, ultimately, again, with the case of the wife of your father's father, your grandfather's wife. Zi'iri says, lahasam shchiach va'azil, lahachalo shchiach va'azil. Apparently, Zi'iri says something very interesting, that it was very common for people to have a close relationship with their father's family than with their mother's family. Take a look at Rashi. Last Rashi on the daf. Hasam shchiach ta'azil lemishpachas aviv. It is common for a person to go and visit his father's family. Therefore, again, v'yodea sheyesh sham kurva. He'll know ultimately again the nature of these relations, and therefore we're not concerned that he may come to transgress. However, yosimim hilchach lav michlafi. Therefore, we'll say again, people won't get confused between the father's side of the family and the mother's side of the family. To which the Gemara says, kalaso, daughter-in-law, amid beis, doraisu. We'll say, so 1 second, what are you including the case of daughter-in-law in the case of shnios? Right? Daughter-in-law is an isser da'araisa. To which the Gemara says, Dichsiv ervas kaloscha lo sigaleh. Torah says you're not allowed to uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. To which the Gemara says what we originally said, Ema kalas bino. No. It's talking about whose daughter-in-law? My son's daughter-in-law. But say, interestingly enough, my son's daughter-in-law is technically speaking not an erva to me, not a daraisa erva to me. She's included in shnios. The kalas beno yesh lahafsik. So I'll say ultimately again, is that true? So again, these are talking about in this grouping now. These are women who themselves are asura, but the isra does not apply to the generation above them or below them. So is that true? So the Gemara says, Kalas b'no, my son's daughter-in-law. V'hatanya, we learned, Kalas ervaso. V'hatanya, Kalaso erva. Ultimately, I will say, one's daughter-in-law is an erva. That's an isra d'oraisa. Kalas b'no shnia. My son's daughter-in-law, that's a shnia. V'chin ata omer. Similarly, again, we say, bivno, uben beno asof koladoros. That ultimately again, this applies ultimately again to the son, grandson, until all future generations. So we'll say, sounds like that the prohibition does extend downwards. Ela ima kalas bino, kalas bito. Rather say that who does it refer to? My daughter's child's daughter-in-law, right? My daughter's son's daughter. My daughter's son's wife. So the Gemara says, the Amar Rav Chisda. I heard this from a great person. Umanu Rabbi Ami. This is Rabbi Ami. What Rabbi Ami say? Lo asur kala ela mipnei kala. They only went ahead and prohibited ultimately the case of daughter-in-law. If you look at Rashi, lo amru kalas bito. Da lessa bebas really means they only prohibited the case of kalas bito. Ultimately, again, because of daughter-in-law. V'amruli kaldai. So listen to this, Rabbi. So let me go back for just a moment. So v'amruli kaldai, and he said to me, the Chaldeim said to me, Rabbi, it's actually quite interesting. Now remember again, this is Rabbi Ami. So Rabbi Ami says the Chaldeim said to me, Melafna habis. You're going to become a very wise man. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Amruli kaldai hachozim bekochavim. So we'll say the Chaldeim were astrologers. They were astrologers. So this is fascinating. So in the middle of this whole idea. So the Chaldeim said to him, ultimately, Malafna habis, you're going to become a great Talmud Chacham. So Rav Ami said, Amina igavra rabba havina asabra midati. If ultimately it means I'm going to become a very wise man on my own, then I'll explain these cases based on my own intellect. But if I'm not going to be a Talmud Chacham, I'm just going to be a Rebbe, then the Gemara says, Ashayla mirabanan da asla bekinishta. I'll ask the Shayla of the Rabbanim who assemble in the base Medrash. Hashta savarasa midati. But now, Baruch Hashem, I matured, and I realized that, Baruch Hashem, I have the knowledge to be able to answer this question myself. Lo asu kalas bito, ela mishum kalas beno. That they only went ahead and prohibited the daughter-in-law of my daughter, lest she come to be confused with the daughter-in-law of my son. So Rabbi say again, these are additional layers of shnios. In reality, the shnia, here's what's interesting. The shnia la'arayos is the daughter-in-law of my son, right? Well, let's go through. What's the doraisa? What's the doraisa? Daughter-in-law, right? The shnia is the daughter-in-law of my son. And by the way, now it sounds like we'll also answer the daughter-in-law of my daughter, lest we come to confuse that case with the daughter-in-law of my son. To which the Gemara says, Amar le'abayi l'rava, asabra l'cha. I'll give you an example of this. Kigon kalasa debe bar tzisoy. This is like the daughter-in-laws of the house of bar tzisoy. So we'll say, so what is that? Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here. Rashi says, "Kegon kalas de bar tzisoy shahaiselo kalas haben the kalas habas va'asu lachlu ve'chinkulu." So we'll say, this is just giving an example. Apparently, in the bar tzisoy family, right, his sons had daughter-in-laws, his daughter had daughter-in-laws, and it was just an example of a tightly knit family where you could easily confuse these two. So we'll say, so the chiddush, I just want to point out what's happening over here. Even though what we call kalas beno, the son's daughter-in-law, is in and of itself a shnia, what do you see happening over here? It appears, what do you see happening over here? It seems like we're actually adding layers even on top of the shnios. So here's an example of, we're going to answer the daughter-in-law of my daughter, lest we come to confuse her with the daughter-in-law of my son, which is a case of a shnia. To which the Gemara says, Papa Amar Kigon Kalasa debei Rav Papa Bar Abba. Rav Ashi Amar Kigon Kalasa debei Mari Bar Asik. Okay, so these are all just examples, I guess, of tightly knit families where you could easily see how one would come to confuse the son's daughter-in-law with, or I should say, the daughter's daughter-in-law with the son's daughter-in-law. Beautiful, great. Ibaylo. Shabbos said the Gemara has the kasha. Eishes achi ha'em min ha'em mahu. Okay, so I'll say a specific case. Eishes achi ha'em min ha'em. So here we go. We have a mother's maternal brother's wife. Right? So the wife, or say it differently, right? The wife of the mother's maternal brother. The wife of the mother's maternal brother. Eishes achi ha'em min ha'em. The wife of one's, right? The wife of the mother's maternal brother. What's the halacha? Mahu. Eishes achi ha'av min ha'em. So we'll say on one hand we have the case of what? So the Eishes achi ha'av min ha'em. If you have the wife of the father's maternal brother, the Eishes achi ha'em min ha'av, or the wife of the mother's paternal brother, di'ika tzad av. So in all of those cases, there's a paternal relationship. Therefore, again, hu d'gazra banan. So say in cases where there's paternal, you begin to see, by the way, that the pattern for shnios is any case where there's some element of paternal relationship there. So the Gemara says, but ultimately in a case where there really is no paternal relationship, ultimately again Chazal will not go there. Or perhaps it doesn't make any difference, they will still go there. Amar Rav Safra, he gufa gzera va'ana nekom v'nigzar gzera legzera. To which Rav Safra said, but come on, this case ultimately again is already, Rashi says, he gufa eishes achi ha'av min ha'em. So we'll say, so again, just to be clear, which case, we're speaking about a very specific case of eishes achi ha'em min ha'em, right? The wife of a mother's maternal brother, right? So a woman has a mother, right? My mother has a maternal brother. His wife, what's her relationship to me? So Rabbi says, listen to this. What the Gemara is essentially saying is like this: the case of the wife of a mother's paternal brother, that already itself is mutter midaraisa, and that case is a shnia. Why is that case a shnia? Why do we include that case? Because there's an element of paternal relationship. That case is already a gzera. That's already a shnia. you're going to now add on an additional layer on top of that to include the mother's maternal brother. That's crazy. As if that's the most crazy thing we've read today, right? That's just crazy. That's exactly. Now, by the way, we've been itching to ask this question this entire time because it sounds like we're doing that, right? Didn't we just do that before? The case of the daughter's daughter-in-law is going to be usher because you confuse with the case of the son's daughter-in-law, but the case of the son's daughter-in-law is a shnia to begin with. It's gzera l'gzera. Amarava. Atu kulun lav gzera l'gzera ninu. So what does Rabbi say? Shkaya. All of this is gzera l'gzera. So Rabbi say what we're doing over here is we're actually piling on multiple levels of rabbinic enactments. So Rabbi say, now by the way, how are you permitted to do that? How are you permitted to add on gzera l'gzera? Rabbi say, you've seen this before. How do Chazal answer that up when they're adding up multiple layers of rabbinic prohibition? Chad gezerahi. It's all part of one gezerah. In other words, they both say, essentially what you begin to see is the concept of shnios kind of gives Chazal the license, or Chazal created for themselves the license of shnios, which essentially says, whatever we need to do to safeguard biblical arayos, we're going to do. And sometimes that means just one level or one layer of rabbinic prohibition, but sometimes it might actually mean a couple of layers of rabbinic prohibition. But it's all part of the same concept of shnios. Atu erva. So the Gemara says, Imo, erva. So we'll say, now watch this. For example, mother. Good, pretty straightforward case, right? No one really, no machlokes with that, right? Imo is an erva. Aim imo shnia. Your mother's mother, right? Grandmother is a shnia. The gazru al aim aviv. Yet Rabbosai, Chazal came along and also said, now remember, so you've got mother and erva, grandmother is a shnia, aim imo, and now the gazru al aim aviv, Chazal came along and said, your father's mother, mishum aim imo. Ultimately, again, it's also because of aim imo. So we'll say, what is this a good example of? What is an example of? It's like a shnia on top of a shnia, right? The real shnia is mother's mother. Chazal then came along and said, father's mother is usher, lest you come to confuse her with mother's mother. The time of my, what's the reason? Kulu debe ima rabasi karle. Chazal call all of them what? Grandma, right? So because they're all called grandma, therefore again we're concerned that if one grandma is permitted, another grandma is prohibited, right? Ultimately again, this can get a bit confusing. Similarly again, Eishes Aviv Erva. Okay, well, this is such helpful Gemara. Why this isn't first, I'm not sure. But let me say, this actually goes through it. Here's it is. Eishes Aviv Erva. Your father's wife, Erva. I will say, obviously not your mother, right? Eishes Aviv Erva. Eishes Avi Aviv Shnia. The wife of your father's father. The wife of your father's father is a Shnia. And yet, Gazru al Eishes Avi Imo, Mishum Eishes Avi Aviv. And Chazal said that the wife of, right, al Eishes Avi Imo, right, the wife, al Eishes Avi Imo, the wife of Avi Imo, ultimately of your mother's father, is going to be Asr. It's the case in order to safeguard the case of the wife of your father's father. And what's the reason for that? Because they're all called grandpa. Right? So because they're all called grandpa, what we're confused is if you allow some grandpa's wives, but not other grandpa's wives, that is going to get confusing. Just like if some grandmas are permitted and some grandmas aren't permitted, that's confusing. Eishes achia av mina av erva. So we'll say ultimately again, the wife of your father's paternal brother, right? So your father's paternal brother's wife is going to be an erva. Eishes achia av minaim shnia, but the wife of your father's maternal brother is a shnia. The gazru al eishes achi ha'im min ha'av, and Abu Sayyid Chazal said that your mother's paternal brother's wife is going to be aser mishum eishes achi ha'av min ha'im, in order to go ahead and safeguard the case of your father's maternal brother's wife. V'taimamai, what's the reason for this? V'taimamai, mishum dekulu debei dodi karile. Because you call all of these people uncle or aunt, right? All of these are called uncles and aunts, and therefore halacha l'maisa again, in order to avoid any level of confusion, we pray on. So we'll say this is actually, I think, a very nice illustration. But what do you begin to see? What you begin to see is that in the construct of shnios, what do you have built into this? That I both say, See, when we started this sugya, what did we think? I don't know what we were thinking. Right? I don't know, but whatever. Right? So as we started this sugya, kind of what you assume is there's daraisa, there's shnia, there's drabanan, and that's it. What we now begin to say is that's actually not true. What there is there's da'araisa. Then on top of da'araisa, there's shnia. But what we do is we build out the shnia construct. And what shnios says is we do whatever we have to do to safeguard the biblical erva. And what that means sometimes is multiple rabbinic layers and levels. Right, so stop over here. What I do want to point out is we did not answer the case of Eshes Achi Ha'im Min Ha'im. We did not answer the case of the wife of the mother's maternal brother. And Meretz Hashem will loop back to that tomorrow. Shkoyach.